Many of you know Dawn's parents, Larry and Naomi, who had visited with us back years ago and knew that she was battling Alzheimer's, has been in a nursing home really for the last 7 years and not able to communicate or do a whole lot. She passed away earlier today, so keep the family in your prayers, keep my kids in your prayers. Haley and I'll probably be traveling down at some point to attend the funeral and be with Larry for a little bit, so I know they would appreciate your prayers. Next quarter. I don't know how many of you, Haley said, isn't this the guy that was just here for a meeting? I said, yes, he is. I don't know how many of you, Wilson did a great job speaking. He's a good speaker, a good preacher. I don't know how many of you have read any of Wilson's material, though. Wilson is an even better writer than he is a speaker. And that's not to detract from his speaking. He's, like I said, he's a good speaker, but he does a really nice job of conveying the truth and life experience and a whole lot of different things. In this book about encouraging one another, building one another up, is going to be our next quarter studies. So for the study that Greg's going to lead us in, there are books back there. If you didn't happen to grab one on the way in, be sure to do that, because that class will begin on Sunday. I don't feel like it's unfair to ask, are we starting in chapter 1? Because I know you don't always like to follow the order that things are in, so. I know when we did Solomon on wealth, I'm not making fun, I'm saying, I just know you, and I know when we did Solomon on wealth, you're like, okay, this is just a kind of a starter block for you, and we may go all kinds of different ways. So, but chapter 1 for Sunday will be where we begin, and I actually kind of appreciate your not being glued to something and taking things kind of either as they come in class or as they come in your own studies. So I appreciate that, but I do know that's an aspect of your personality that I appreciate. What? Hey, that's all right. You get it done. So we are finishing chapter 12. We probably will do a survey of chapter 13. So if you've studied 13, hopefully, and answered some questions, thought about the text, the end of class will probably just bring chapter 13 up, so to speak, and you can throw at me anything that we want to, words, verbal, nothing, no physical objects. I used to be really good at dodgeball. I'm not sure I'd be so great at it now, but so none of that. But we'll begin in chapter 12 and verse 19 or 18. Sorry, the numbers are a little and my eyes are not as great as they used to be, which is why I carry these. Supposed to put them on, I think, is how they work. But I do want to read this text. A lot of good things in this text. An identifier for the church, for one, and a description of who we are. But there are some other things, more comparisons between the old and new, that I don't want us to miss out on, and to recognize what he's really saying. And even though they apply specifically to a comparison and contrast between the old and the new, I want us to think about some ways that it can apply for us. Okay, verse 18 beginning. For you have not come to what may be touched, but a blazing fire, and darkness and gloom and a tempest and the sound of a trumpet and a voice, whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them. For they could not endure the order that was given, if even a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gatherings, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. See that you do not refuse him who is speaking. For if they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, much less will we escape if we reject him who warns from heaven. At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth but also the heavens. This phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of things that are shaken, that is, things that have been made, in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. Okay, so we start back in verse 18. What is this talking about in verses 18, really all the way through verse 21? There are multiple things that are taken from the Old Testament, from Old Testament passages in this particular passage itself. In fact, there's some sense in which we could say there's a portion taken from the law, there's a portion taken from the writings or the Psalms, and there's a portion that's taken from the prophets. So it's kind of a summation and a bringing together of all that has been written before and how that is now fulfilled in Christ. So what is 18 through 21 dealing with? First, it's a specific event in the history of Israel. It is. It's Mount Sinai. It's the time, the occasion in Exodus when God called Moses up to the mountain to give him the tablets of the law, and he spoke to the people about the covenant that they were entering into with him there. And on that particular occasion, you remember the mountain, Mount Sinai, burned with smoke and fire, and they were told to stay a certain distance from it, not to touch it, not even to allow a beast to touch the mountain. And then God spoke to them from the mountain, and that's when the people said, "It is too much for us, we can't bear it, we can't endure it." And God called Moses up on the mountain and gave him the tablets and spoke the covenant to him for him to deliver to the people. That's the occasion that's being talked about here. And he begins by saying, verse 18, "You have not come to what may be touched." So when Israel came to receive their covenant, they came to a mountain that could be touched. Now, by saying that, we go on to read, it says, but they weren't allowed to touch it. But they could touch it. I mean, the point is, Mount Sinai was a physical mountain that they could lay hands on. And the only reason they couldn't on that occasion was because God was there and it was holy ground. Kind of like when Moses approached the burning bush. There was nothing really holy about the bush. It was God's presence in the bush or at the bush that made it holy. And so the same thing with Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai itself wasn't holy, and there were all kinds of times, I'm sure, in the history of mankind that the mountain's been touched. But on that occasion, it was holy because God was there and they couldn't touch it. But you haven't come to what may be touched. So what does that mean? And he goes on in verse 22 to tell us what we've come to. And how is it described? How is the location, so to speak, where we have come to, how is it described? For one, because we're talking about in verses 18 through 21, a mountain that may be touched, what have we come to in verses 22 and following? We have come to... Okay. And it's referred to as what, though? One of the phrases, at least, it's used is, it's the city of the living God, heavenly Jerusalem. In the context of what we just looked at in 18 through 21, it is Mount Zion. That terminology has been used, especially in the Psalms, which is why I said there's a reference that falls within the Psalms, because Mount Zion was used frequently in the Psalms. It's actually used of at least a couple of different things, though, right? What is Mount Zion? If you were to boil it down in its simplest terms, And again, we're not talking about a physical location. Mount Zion, and I'm asking you to remember something that's in the Psalms. It's easy for me because I've thought about it in connection with this class. But Mount Zion, what's another term we could use to describe it? It is the mountain of... Whose mountain is it? It's God's mountain. It is. And it's used of Jerusalem some in the Old Testament, is it not? Synonymously with Jerusalem. Why could Jerusalem be called Mount Zion? I mean, it's simple. Because the temple was there, God's presence was there. When Israel was faithful, God dwelt in their midst, and that's where He dwelt. And so that was, in a sense, in a type, again, as a copy, it was Mount Zion. But Mount Zion is the mountain of God. What was Mount Sinai on this occasion? It was the mountain of God. It could have been called Mount Zion. I don't know that it ever is referred to in that way because of the nature of the differentiation that takes place in this place and in the Psalms and other places. But it could have been called on that occasion the mountain of God because God was there. So Mount Zion is the mountain of God. It is the mountain of God's rule, to use the term Greg used. And so, but we have come not to the mountain that may be touched. Think back in chapter 9. What temple did Jesus come into? The temple that was what? Made without hands, without men's hands. So Jesus came to the temple that was made without hands. We have now come to the Mount Zion that cannot be touched. It's not a physical location in the sense that we can walk up and put our hands on it. It is the mountain of God. How else is it described in this text? Beautiful language is used to describe all of these things, or this place.
It states there's myriad of angels.
Okay, an innumerable host of angels is there. What else? I know we've already had a few of the others. City of the living God. Okay, the church of the firstborn ones. And so, I don't know. I really like that name for the church, by the way. Church of the firstborn. This is the only place that it's used. But there are a number of terms that are used to describe the church that are only used on one occasion. I do like the fact that the English Standard Version uses the assembly of the firstborn instead of the word church, because church has been so... church in the English language has been so turned into a word that is just a religious, spiritual word. And the Greek word that is used to describe the church, or used as a name for the church, is actually just a word that meant assembly. And so there are lots of assemblies. I think somebody recently talked about the fact that there are assemblies they're not even spiritual in nature. I mean, there's an assembly in Acts 19 in Ephesus that was a riotous mob of people trying to kill Paul and the disciples. And so, but it's called an assembly, and it's the word ecclesia, which is translated church in most of our English translations when it refers to the spiritual body of God's people. But it is a general word that just means an assembly. We are the assembly of the firstborn ones. What else? It goes on to describe us, the assembly of the firstborn who are what? This ought to be special to us. Who are enrolled in heaven. Our names are in the book of life. That should mean something to us, that our names are enrolled in heaven. God knows who we are, and our names are written in His book. And to use terminology found in the book of Revelation, His mark is on our forehead. Can you see it? It's sort of a trick question. Can you see it? So, I hear yes. Can you say no? Okay, it's not one of those spots that like a birthmark. It's not one of those spots that you look at and say, "Oh, I see the mark on your forehead. That's the mark of God." But you can see it. You can see it in the way that we live. When there are characteristics of God that are reflected in our lives, it's evident. But our names are enrolled in heaven. God's mark is upon us. Then he says, and we've come to God who is the judge of all, to the spirits of the righteous made perfect. I think about that one. How special is that? What is one of the things that we look forward to that death brings? Yes, obviously we get to be with God. That's the whole point of heaven. But who else do we get to be with? This is one of the things that we cling to it with hope that carries us through our grief here. The faithful who've gone before us, the righteous made perfect, we get to be with them too, who are already not only enrolled in heaven, but are with God in His presence. We long for that. We get to be with God, the judge. We get to be with Jesus, the mediator. We get to be with all of those. And so that's this picture that's here. This is not a mountain that you can touch. It is a spiritual mountain. It is a location that is the presence of God. But he says, interestingly enough, in verse 22, you have come, doesn't he? Not you will come. It's not future tense. You have come, which means what?
If you look at the language in Revelation, where you have those who are under the throne who are in conversation with God and say, when will our blood be avenged? You really get a very strong impression that these that have been perfected of God are already in God's presence, that there doesn't seem to be any separation, that they're right there where they can talk with him. From that and from what this says in Hebrews, it sounds like the Hebrew writer is almost channeling the language of some of Revelation.
Right.
And I can only conclude that as it's written here in a present tense, and as it's revealed by John in a present tense, now he could be speaking of future visions, but as it's revealed to him, it's in present tense.
Right.
And given the context of what they're asking for in that throne scene in Revelation, it makes a strong case that there are men who have suffered and died for the cause of God, and maybe even the cause of Christ, who are with God's in his presence right at the time that they've been perfected.
Where are we right now? Or I guess I know we're on earth. Who is in our presence?
We should be able to make an argument that we can be right in this midst as well.
That's exactly right. I mean, there is some sense in which, yes, we are a part of the physical realm, the physical world, and there are lots of unseen things from our perspective that we can't witness with our eyes. Was Elijah and his servant, or Elisha and his servant, any less surrounded by the army of God when they couldn't see it? No. Are we any less with God when we can't see Him? Or is He any less with us? No. And when I say, are we any less with Him, we obviously talk about the fact that God is omnipresent, and so He is everywhere, or can be everywhere. He's not limited to location or time or any of those things. But the reality is that while that is true, is He with His people in a unique and special sense? Is that any less true now than it will be eternally, even though we can't see it? Go back to Hebrews 11. Faith is the evidence of things not seen, right? Substance of things not seen, the evidence of things or substance of things hoped for, evidence of things not seen. There, I got it right finally. It's no less true now. We are already a part of Mount Zion. We are already a part of the innumerable company. We're already enrolled in heaven. All of those things are already true. Now, the difference is at this point, can we still forfeit that? Yes, Israel was a part of a covenant when God came to Mount Sinai. Could they forfeit it? Yes. We could forfeit ours and lose our privileged position. God talks about those in the book of Revelation whose names will be blotted out of the book of life. What does that mean? It was there and now it's not. And so we can have that happen. But the reality is that right now we are already a part of the assembly of the firstborn ones. We already have God's presence with us, dwelling with us, and are already enrolled in that number. And so all of those things are true. It's not a physical mountain you can touch. It's not a physical thing that you can see, but it doesn't make it any less real. We're already there. The heavenly Jerusalem. By the way, that language is used in Revelation 21. And it talks about, I saw the heavenly Jerusalem come down from where? Out of heaven. If the heavenly Jerusalem came out of heaven, is it heaven? If it came out of heaven, can it be heaven? Or can they be one and the same? And then he goes on later in the text to say, I will show to you the bride of Christ. Who is the bride of Christ? It's us. We are the bride of Christ. Who is the heavenly Jerusalem? This text and others. We are. We are the heavenly Jerusalem. Because Jerusalem describes what? It's okay, and I mean this from the physical perspective. Now come back to earth for a little bit. Now let's regain the ground. What was Jerusalem? What is Jerusalem? It's not was, it still exists. What is Jerusalem? It's a city. What do cities have in them? How do they become cities? Huh? They have citizens. They have people in them. So, heavenly Jerusalem. Jerusalem describes a city. This city is not the physical Jerusalem that you can go and put your hands on and see things in, which would be fascinating, I think. You can have your own opinion about that. But it would be fascinating to see that. We're not a part of that Jerusalem. We're a part of the heavenly Jerusalem. The heavenly Jerusalem describes a city. Cities have citizens. Who's the citizens? Who are the citizens? Who are the citizens? Oh, come on. It's not hard. You can say it. You can even include yourself. We're the citizens. We are a part of this heavenly Jerusalem. So all of this language is describing us. I think the same thing's true in Revelation 21, by the way, because the heavenly Jerusalem can't be heaven or it wouldn't come out of heaven or come down from heaven. And the bride of Christ never describes heaven, it describes the church. And so we are those people. That's what's being described here. You are the people of God. You are all of these wonderful things. It's not a city like you see on earth where people can touch and hold and live in a physical sense. It is a spiritual city. And the city of Jerusalem, when it was at its prime and in its good places, was the city where God's presence dwelt. So where are we? We are the city where God's presence dwells. Other passages like 1 Corinthians 3 and 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and 1 Corinthians chapter 6 refer to us as the what? Well, the body of Christ is used frequently in Corinthians, but in 1 Corinthians 3 and 1 Corinthians 6, there's another location that's used. We've got heavenly Jerusalem here. We are the body of Christ. 1 Corinthians 12 and 1 Corinthians 10 and other places. 1 Corinthians 3 and 6, we are the temple of God. What was the temple? place where God's presence dwells. So all of this is describing that we are the place where God's presence dwells. That's who we are. Because of what? Verse 24. Did I jump ahead and answer it for you?
I was going to talk about we're being a temple and we're the house of God.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we are the house of God. That's the household of God is used frequently as well. Why is all that possible? Why are we the place where God's presence dwells? Verse 24. Because of Jesus. I mean, it's plain and simple. Everything Moses did was great. The covenant that God established through Moses it did its job. It did what it was supposed to do. The blood that was sacrificed, it also provided a copy and a shadow and was helpful in the ways that God designed it to be. But it is the blood of Jesus that makes us the city of the living God, the assembly of the firstborn. It is the reason why we have the right to be in the presence of God and to be the heavenly Jerusalem, this Mount Zion, the city of the living God. So, is that a big deal? Yeah. So, because it's a big deal, and because and I mean, this is so fitting in our own culture, because all you hear about in social media and the world that we live in for the most part is that God is what? Oh no, in the world, for the most part, among people who profess to be Christians in the world. Yeah, you are right. Most of the world looks at it and says, our lives are awful. If there is a God, He's just an angry God who wants to destroy everything and wants to make our lives miserable. But among people in the world that call themselves Christians, God is only what? He is only love. God is love. Is that true? Yeah, 1 John 4:8 for one place says God is love. That is true. And the Bible is full of examples of the fact. I mean, the very cross itself is evidence of the fact that God is love. But the Hebrew writer wants to make sure that we understand that while God is love, God is also what? He says it right here at the end of this chapter in verse 29. Our God is a consuming fire. Why is that? Because God is what? He is just. So God is love, and the reality is, I mean, if He had a choice, I mean, if He got to choose for everybody, which one would He rather show, love or wrath? It's clear, biblically speaking, it is clear. The side God wants everyone to get to experience is His love and mercy and grace. But that doesn't mean He's going to set aside everything He's ever said and just give it to you whether you want it or not. And so there's this other side of God, in essence, it's this other aspect of His personality is really a better way to put it. This other aspect of His holiness and His goodness that demands ultimately that we either pay for our own sins or we accept the gift that was made on our behalf. And so He warns us, do not refuse Him who speaks to us from heaven. Because there was one who spoke to them from earth. Who is that in the context of this passage? It was Moses. Remember, God tried to talk to them directly, and they said, no, we can't bear it. You go hear what He has to say, and you come back and tell us. So Moses got the message and brought it back down to them and told them what the message was. And so Moses spoke to them from the earth. But now who's spoken to us? Go all the way back to chapter 2. Now He's spoken to us through His Son. He's spoken to us through Jesus, the one who came from heaven. So if there was a just recompense, this brings it back memories of chapter 10 and other places. if there was a just recompense for everyone who was disobedient to the law that was brought by Moses from the earth, how much more must there be a just payment for those who refuse to heed the message brought from the very Son of God himself down to the earth? And so he then rolls into another text from the Old Testament. Anybody happen to know where this one comes from? Yet once more, and I will shake not only the earth but also the heavens. Anybody know where that's from? I already gave you a hint that it's in the prophets, but you say, well, that's not much of a hint. There's 12 minor prophets, and huh? You're exactly right. It's a little minor prophet that most of us probably don't think about a whole lot. Haggai. And so this passage from Haggai, anybody remember the context of when Haggai was written? It does. The rebuilding of the temple after the exile. So the Israelites, the people of Judah had been in captivity for 70 years in Babylon. They come back to the land, and after a long period of time, they finally rebuild the temple. And when they started to rebuild the temple when Haggai's written. They've laid the foundations. And the people who witnessed the first temple, when they saw the foundations of this temple laid, do you remember what they did? They cried. I mean, a more accurate term might be that they bawled. I mean, they looked at this and they said, this is a pitiful excuse for a temple compared to what Solomon's temple was. Nonetheless, the message of Habakkuk or of Haggai is, you get busy building my house, and you see if I don't do everything I've promised for you. And so he actually says in the context of Haggai chapter 2 that the glory of this second house will be greater than the glory of the first. But when you read the overall context of Haggai 2, what is primarily in view is not actually this second temple they're building, but what? Or better yet, who? It's messianic. Zerubbabel, or Zerubbabel, depending on how you pronounce his name, is one of the ones who's there during that occasion. He is specifically singled out as going to be one of the people who is going to be important because one of his descendants is going to be somebody to look to. And his temple that he's going to build is going to be even greater. Who is the descendant of Zerubbabel? You may not know remember from Haggai, but in the context of this class, it's pretty easy. In the context of this class, who's the only one that matters? It's Jesus. So Jesus is a descendant of Zerubbabel. What is the house that he came to build? You're looking at it. We're it. So we are that house. This is the house that's being spoken of. And again, think about it in the first century context. But this phrase, yet once more, I will shake not only the earth but also the heavens. We read that, what are we inclined to think of? From 21st century America. The end of the world. I mean, we think of the apocalypse. It's got to be describing the end of everything. But in the context of this book and Haggai, what is being spoken of? Because he says he's going to shake the things that can be seen. What are those? I mean, the context of this passage in Hebrews 12, what are the things that can be seen? Go back to the very beginning of verse 18. It was the old symbols of the physical things you could touch. So the thing that is going to be shaken, that is described in this context as the shaking not only of the heaven or of the earth, but also the heavens, is ultimately the destruction of the whole concept of Judaism altogether, and specifically the temple that's still standing. God is going to destroy that. And so once that happens, what is going to be left? The mountain that cannot be shaken, which is what? Or who? It's us. It's the church. It's the people of God. And so we are what remains after this shaking takes place. Go ahead.
And I sit here and think about Sinai and the fact that the mountain quaked
Yes.
when God's presence was there. But then I've always kind of wondered about, why did God see to the destruction of the first set of tablets? You know, I know that they came down to the camp and the camp was having their wild
Right.
parties and all that. But if you think about the symbols and the fact that God even saw to the demolition of the law itself on stone, that was a foreshadowing too of this passage.
Right.
I never thought about it that way, that you had, if you could to your core think of what would make Israel more nervous, it would be God's finger having written on tablets and then those to be destroyed. Oh man, we have messed up now.
Right.
But those were things that could be touched.
Right.
And they were not permanent things. The law, of course, God, that symbol also suggests there will be a law written on the hearts, which can never be shaken, destroyed, broken into pieces, because it will be in the dwelling place of God, his people.
Right. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about the tablets too and the symbiology there. But so we've got all this imagery, but ultimately what's going to happen is all of those things that were a part of the first covenant will be destroyed. And the end result of that is that what remains, that which cannot be shaken, will be the true people of God, and which, by the way, I think is the whole message of the book of Revelation. That in this first century period, you've got two people claiming to be the people of God. Who the Jews claim to be? They're the people of God. They're the chosen people of God. Who is the church claiming to be? The people of God, the chosen people of God. Which one's right? Because they're preaching different messages, by the way. Which one's right? The Christians are. They're the right ones. How you know? I mean, it's just two different groups of people claiming to be the chosen people of God. How do you know which one's the real people of God? Because throughout the history of the first covenant, and a few times in the second, God made prophecies that said, in the end, what was he going to do to the temple and the old order? He was going to destroy it. Did he do it? AD 70 and the destruction of the temple was God's public proclamation that which people were telling the truth. The church or the Jews? The church. What still exists? You can still claim that Orthodox Judaism exists, but as I've said before, it can't. Because Orthodox Judaism revolves around the temple and temple worship and sacrifice and all those things. What can't be offered now? Where can the Jews not go? They can't go to the temple. Huh? They can go to the Dome of the Rock. Who actually built the Dome of the Rock? Yeah, I mean, it was built by the Muslims. Of course, the battle over that mount is because both of them claim the mountain. But the reality is it was God's declaration, and he's talking about it right here. I'm going to destroy the things that can be shaken so that what cannot be shaken will remain. What can't be shaken? What will never be shaken? The assembly of the firstborn will never be shaken and destroyed. And so it will always stand. It has stood from the moment that it was established, and it will stand until time is no more. Because God said so, to use a parental phrase. Okay, anything else about chapter 12? What about chapter 13? You've got exactly 3 minutes. You know me. Maybe you've got 5. Because I won't stop till everybody's up here and some of you start getting restless and like, when is he going to quit? What about chapter 13 stood out to you? I know we're talking about 13:5. We talked about that a little bit on, what's tonight? Wednesday, Sunday morning, in connection with some of the stuff in the middle part of chapter 12. This section 3 through 5. Verse 5 says, "Keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you." New King James Version. Who's got New King James, and we'll read it? Go ahead. Okay. So what are some important takeaways from that particular passage? That's a good point. For those of you who couldn't hear and for those who are at home, Samantha said she was having a discussion with someone who said covetousness and contentment can't go together. You will either have one or the other. You can't have them both. And so you'll either be covetous and therefore not content, or you'll be content and therefore not covetous. I think that's probably accurate. I mean, perhaps is a big part of what this passage is saying. What else? Are they connected, or is this just a rattling off a bunch of miscellaneous? Okay, I would agree with that. Samantha said that God is saying, the fact that I will never leave you nor forsake you should make us content. I mean, the reality is, what more should we want than the knowledge of the fact that God will be with us through whatever we face? Does that mean we won't struggle with contentment? I mean, I agree. I think, as Samantha said, it's like everything else. We always have our struggles. Okay, it's kind of like that root of bitterness that we talked about. No root of bitterness springing up. Will we be bitter? Likely. Yeah. Yes, you can. It depends on what was the old story? Which wolf wins? The one you feed. Jesus said it this way: wherever your treasure is, there what? Your heart will be also. Are there occasions when something that's kind of shiny or flashy gets our attention? But when we remember that it's not the things that can be shaken, which are physical and are also temporary, but the things that cannot be shaken, that should keep our attention and with which we should be content, then we get our focus back where it needs to be. So like Greg said, if it's a momentary light affliction and we turn away from it, through whose help? To go back to Samantha's passage in 13:5. God's help, because he will never leave us nor forsake us. We are never on our own. Then we can get through those and be content with what we have. And as Paul said in Philippians chapter 4, learn contentment. Learn to be content in whatever state that we are. Okay, so we sort of made it through Hebrews. We made it through 12 chapters of Hebrews, and then just kind of we did our best. or I did my best. You all would have done better probably, but anyway, thank you for your help through the class. I appreciate it, and look forward to Greg's class beginning on Sunday morning.